The Commanders and the Texans want Deebo Samuel, according to Jordan Schultz. Deebo's on the trade block, and these are two teams that know him. D'Amico Ryans was with the Niners, knows Deebo. Adam Peters with the Niners, knows Deebo. D'Amico, of course, is the head coach of the Houston Texans, and Adam Peters, the general manager of the Washington Commanders. This is interesting to me because I felt with Deebo, it could go one of two ways. If people really have a lot of confidence in Kyle Shanahan, they might think, well, if it won't work with Kyle, then it won't work with me. If Kyle's out on Deebo and it's not working there anymore, why would I do better? I look up to Kyle. I admire Kyle. But this seems to almost be two of his former colleagues saying, you know what? I understand the issue between those two guys. And it seems to be a dynamic between those two guys. And Deebo will work with me. You bring him into a different locker room with a different head coach, and Deebo will play hard. Deebo will be an impact player. Maybe that's not true, but it seems like that's the perception the Commanders and the Texans have. And I just think that's really interesting that D'Amico and Adam Peters seem to think that they can succeed where Kyle Shanahan has failed. I wonder what Adam Peters and D'Amico Ryans really think privately of Kyle Shanahan. I'm sure they have a lot of respect for him, but I think they may be thinking they can profit from Kyle Shanahan's botched relationship. Now, it was reported that Deebo was 20 pounds overweight this year. That would, I would think, turn off a lot of teams, scare teams. But if they're thinking, well, that's just because he doesn't respect Kyle Shanahan, and I was there and I've seen it. I was in the organization. I know he doesn't really respect Kyle. Kyle doesn't challenge him. Kyle treats him like a friend. Kyle doesn't really – the only person who ever challenged him in the organization was Wes Welker, who left 4 years ago. Bring him over here. We'll have a different locker room. I'll challenge him. And Deebo wants to be challenged. He doesn't want a friend. He doesn't respect – I mean, maybe that's how they feel. I didn't know which way it would go. But it seems like people who know Deebo, people who know Kyle, they want in on this. And that would make John Lynch, if I were John Lynch, I'd feel uneasy. Okay, so we're trading a guy to our former defensive coordinator, to my former assistant GM, and they want him, and they think you mismanaged him. Are you sure you're wrong? Are you sure they're wrong? Kind of scary. Because the thing about Deebo Samuel, even though he was just awful in 2024, he was excellent in 2023. And if he could go to another team and lose 20 pounds and stay in shape, that would look really bad on the Niners. It would look like they're ineffective. Like players just stop respecting them after a while. I mean, maybe that's not the case. So maybe this is good news for the Niners. Maybe they trade Deebo Samuel to some naive team that stuck in the past, has some idea of what Deebo Samuel was 2-3 years ago and holding on to that. Maybe they trade Deebo Samuel for a 4th, 5th round pick to some team that's going to learn the hard way about what Deebo Samuel is at this point in his career, and the Niners will win this. Maybe this is good news. But it would make me think twice. Adam Peters wants him? Damn. He hasn't talked himself out of Deebo? Damn. D'Amico has a pretty good read of people. At least former players. So, look, it is interesting. The backdrop of all this, John Lynch said at the Combine a few days ago that the Niners need to recalibrate their roster, reset it, because they've spent so much cash the last 8 years. Number 2 in cash spending the last 8 years. So what do we know? We know that they have tighter constraints financially, according to John Lynch. That was his phrase. The Yorks are exploring selling a 10% stake in their ownership. And they're trading off stars. Another wide receiver they could trade, Brandon Ayuk. Now, this is interesting. There was a report a few days ago that teams were poking around about trading for Ayuk, and you just go online and look at Ayuk's contract and look at the salary cap penalties the Niners would take on by trading Ayuk in the near future, and it just seems ridiculous. Like they're not going to hurt themselves that much in terms of salary cap to move him, but salary cap isn't like real. I mean, it's real, but it's not cash. It's just what you're allowed to spend on your team. Trading Ayuk would get the Niners out of paying him any more cash. and he has a lot more cash due on his contract. And it seems like the Niners are trying to pare back spending. So when asked about would they trade Ayuk, Lynch didn't walk that back at all. He was like, yeah, you get calls like that a lot and you listen. And the reason we're listening is because we spent too much money and we have to recalibrate and we have to reset. And that's some hard decisions. That's what he said. So not only is Deebo out on the way out, it looks like Ayuk could be on the way out as well. In which case, the Niners wide receivers would be Ricky Pearsall and Jawan Jennings. And the thing about that is Jawan Jennings will be a free agent next year, and I don't know if the Niners will bring him back. So suddenly, wide receiver is looking like a big position of need and something the Niners really could take in round one. Going back to Deebo for a second, let's say they trade him to Washington. They could trade him for a pick, or what's interesting about Washington, they have a defensive tackle, former first-round pick Jonathan Allen, who requested a trade recently. So sometimes teams could flip disgruntled veteran getting phased out for disgruntled veteran getting phased out. And we know the Niners desperately need a defensive tackle because they traded 3 first-round picks and a third for Trey Lance and got nothing and are suffering the consequences of that deal because one of those picks probably would have been a hell of a defensive tackle, and they gave it away. So, yeah, that's where they stand. They are suffering the consequences of their prior decisions. They almost certainly have to take a defensive tackle with their first pick, but if they trade Ayuk and Deebo, they may need a wide receiver as well. They could trade Deebo to Washington for Jonathan Allen straight up. Deebo goes to Washington, loses 15 pounds, and becomes the, yak specialist, flanker, slot guy to complement their split end Terry McLaurin. If he's in shape, it works. If he's at his best, you put him in a zone read RPO offense with Jaden Daniels and Cliff Kingsbury, it just might work. On the flip side, if the Niners get Jonathan Allen, now they don't necessarily have to draft a defensive tackle in round one. They still could, right? They could have their starting defensive tackles be Jonathan Allen and a first-round pick. Certainly. I think that might even be a better option for the 49ers than getting a day 3 pick. This is an older team that needs starters. They're committed to making another run with this older team, and a 4th or 5th round pick may not start on this team, although it might. But getting Jonathan Allen couldn't hurt. That would be an interesting trade. And then for Ayuk, I don't know who ultimately would want him. Maybe the teams that were interested in him last year. I mean, if you wanted Ayuk last year, you could get him now for 20% of the price. If you're offering a late first or early second for Ayuk, maybe you offer a 5th for him now, and the Niners would be inclined to trade him just to not pay him any more cash, just to get out from a negative valued asset, right? I think that's what they're looking at. That's a negative valued asset. He's never going to be worth the money they pay him for a lot of reasons. Even if he hadn't torn his knee up, he probably never would have been worth the money they paid him, but they could fantasize about a future where he gets a bunch of targets in a different system on a different team. Now that future is not going to come. So they're probably just going to walk away from the investment. And if they get anything for it, that's a bonus.